Alright, so this one was a bit of a debate because it pretty much started with me knowing that I wanted to do the Mothman Prophecies. I just didn't know with what. So I just did the old thing of Googling movies like the Mothman Prophecies, and a few things came up, but the one that seemed to be the most consistent with this search was Stir of Echoes. And the more I was kind of surprised, but then the more I thought about it, the more it is like it does deal in like the premonitions and the seemingly normal people that start acting really bizarrely, and there's the whole mystery of are they just weird people, or is this some sort of supernatural thing that's affecting them and making them this way? Which you can find a lot of in like the Will Patton character in Mothman, for instance. Obviously, stuff like the fourth kind came up, which probably does make sense to go with it. But I mean, if your choices are Stir of Echoes or the fourth kind, which one's going to be the better one to talk about? Clearly, I'm not a fan of the latter, so we're gonna. This is what I settled on. So, if you want to hear about the fourth kind, surely it'll come up at some point. But I kind of felt like doing two things that interest me significantly more. So, and I actually want to start with Stir of Echoes. Because there's a whole other thing to go into with Mothman, considering that I live about an hour away from Point Pleasant, so there's that whole thing. But before that, we'll start with Stir of Echoes, where pretty much right away, our director is David Cope, who would go on to do a number of things. He's mainly known as a screenwriter, but he also he brought us like Premium Rush and stuff like that. But before that, he brought us this horror movie based on the book A Stir of Echoes. They really changed the title on that. And what's interesting about this is there is a certain layout for movies like Stir of Echoes that's very, well, cliche, obviously, but also just very identifiable, and you pretty much know the exact layout of where it's headed and how it starts and all that other stuff. So usually in movies like this, where we're headed towards a conclusion that's basically finding out the backstory of the ghost that's been haunting you the whole movie, there's usually like this little prologue that usually sets that up. But the interesting thing that the movie does is, first off, makes that whole thing the mystery itself, so it can't be the beginning. So we have to have an effective first scene that kind of sets the horror tone without doing that. So the question is, what is that and how can you do it effectively? Well, the movie finds a way where it starts off with this very innocent scene of Kevin Bacon and the son in the bath, and there's like, so this is kind of an odd opening scene for this horror movie. It's like, how's this going to be the tone? And it just is a normal scene until the very last line. Suddenly you realize where you are. When the kid looks off into the distance, into nothing, he's staring at the wall and asks, does it hurt to be dead? And it's like, with this whole build-up, the way they can do what usually people drag out in full scenes of, like, full carnage or something, or even not some backstory thing, but maybe just some ghost attack that starts it. And Code managed to do this with one line to set this whole thing off, and I thought that was absolutely brilliant. Just start from there and then go forward, especially as a movie that gets crazier and fucking crazier as it goes. It's that it starts at such a small level actually makes perfect sense in regards to its progression, so I really love that. And then we start meeting the characters with Bacon and his wife, but then there's also the brother and sister-in-law, Kevin Dunn and Ileana Douglas. And the interesting thing about these characters is that lately, lately also, but for a while, horror movies, particularly supernatural movies, involve a young cast of young people doing stupid shit before they're haunted. And interestingly enough, even though the main stars and characters of this movie are adults, they still kind of act like youthful. Like, they do the same sort of stupid teenager things, whether it be the way they talk to each other, especially the Ileana Douglas character, but also the way that, like this all starts because they're at a party that looks like a college party, and they end up doing something stupid that basically unleashes this whole thing. So I like that it feels like the same formula, but just a change in character can make it feel, like, fresh, interestingly enough. And at the center of this movie is obviously this particular Kevin Bacon performance, which is probably easily one of his best. And the thing about this is that he's, once again, when you look at the beginning, starting off, the whole idea is that not only is he like an ordinary dude, like a normal dude, but he's so ordinary that he hates that part of himself, and how he was gonna be this musician or whatever, but he's just this ordinary dude, and he feels like his life never really got interesting in any way. So of course, if you're in a horror movie and you say that, your life's going to get interesting in all the wrong ways. And this eventually, quickly actually, delves into this performance that has to be, like, so convincingly manic, almost non-stop, like, as soon as this starts. Because, like, at one point, he's just the dude that doesn't believe in hypnosis, and he's ready to leave this party and go home and go to bed or whatever. And then after this hypnosis, for the entire rest of the movie, he cannot... There is no more small parts to this performance. It's going to be all manic, all crazy, all paranoid, everything. And he just does that so well through the entire thing. And the way that it plays up, like, these different ways in which he's affected by what he's saying, whether it be, like, the hallucinations or the flashes of this, what he doesn't realize yet is the crime scene in his house, and then there's, like, the whole red light thing when the babysitter comes and, like, everything turns red and there's that whirring sound, and then this, as he goes to that event that they were going to, every time he sees a red light he hears that same sound, and just the different ways this sort of comes down on him and really just takes him apart internally even more as it happens, breaking out that manic way about him even more as it goes on. And the interesting thing about this is that the character is so affected by this and so changed by this that his own presence actually starts to feel as unsettling, if not more so, than the weird things that he's seeing, the potential... It's hard to say premonition because he's seeing the past, but then there's also the future also when he sees Kevin Dunn in his living room, which we learn very, very late exactly what that means, which I really like. It's one of those things that's actually clever in the way that you almost kind of forget that happened, and then when it comes back it's actually a genuine surprise that everything fits together so perfectly, and how well thought out this story was from the get-go, and how it managed to put itself together as it revealed itself. Because usually, when you get to the climax and you're like revealing all your pieces and everything's coming together, usually at some point you're gonna shit the bed and something's gonna seem like really half-assed or really rushed or something. But this movie knew what it was doing from the start, and you can really tell that in how the story puts itself together as we get to the end. And that's the thing too, is like as he goes on, you don't know. As it goes on, you don't know what you're going to see. You don't know what he's going to see. So just seeing him alone walk into a scene, you're unsettled of maybe not necessarily what he might do, but what he might bring with him. And there's even that moment when the movie starts to feel that way, where he goes to like that town gathering or whatever that is, and when the camera actually pans over to him suddenly, you hear like a record scratch and the music stops. That might sound bad on paper, particularly if you don't remember the scene, but it does surprisingly work in regards to making just him being in the scene alone just something so sort of unsettling. So that's great, and then it actually gets to a point where he starts off the way that he does. By the time we get to towards the end and he's like screaming insanely while jackhammering into his basement floor, it kind of just makes sense how we got here. Like the progression actually gets all the way there, and you're just like, yes, this is what this character would be doing right about now. I get it. And it sort of goes into, obviously this was a couple years before, but it always reminded me of Frailty, the whole scene where he has to just keep digging, doesn't know quite where he's going, but just has to keep digging for however long it is. It feels like an eternity, but it does ultimately pay off in a really nice way. So, and they do have these, obviously the main scares come from the hallucinations, and we don't know what we're going to see or when it's going to happen or all that. But the movie also seems to set up these interesting scares, like, I mean, I guess you could say they're jump scares, or they avoid that, depending on which scene it is, but they all kind of sets up like it's in one scene, and then they use that formula like 2 more times. Because, like, you feel like maybe they're setting up a rule of 3 in the baby monitor scene with the, I think it's the babysitter, when it's like she hears something, and we know it's going to be loud, but, so because she puts the baby monitor up to her ear. But the thing is she listens once, and then puts it down, and then puts it up again, and doesn't hear anything. We know the 3rd time is going to be when it's loud, and of course that's when it is. And then it seems like they use putting that into our brains for a couple of scenes later, like the really brilliant scene when he sees her on the couch, and once he does, he's like, for the rest of the movie, he's expecting to see her on the couch again in the same spot. So it's the way the camera moves in this scene, the way he's sitting, where he turns, and it almost makes you jump just instinctively, the way the camera turns so quickly to the empty side of the couch. And then it does it a second time, but the thing is because this one's more elaborate with, like, the camera moving, we think maybe she will be there the second time. And when she's not there the second time, and we're expecting the 3rd time, like it was with the baby monitor, the scene ends. And I just love the way they sort of use that sort of misdirection after planting the seeds of previous scenes. And then, of course, I feel like this also kind of leads into the mirror scare, when his wife's in the bathroom and she's got the medicine cabinet open, and we think, obviously, because we've seen the fake-outs before, like we saw that the baby monitor didn't go off the first time she did it, she wasn't there the first or second time the camera showed them side of the couch. So when it gets to the medicine cabinet scene, we're like, oh, we know this old cliche. We're supposed to think that the medicine cabinet's going to close and she's not going to be there. But they've set up that whole, we're going to do things more than once, and maybe there will be a reveal, maybe they won't. And we're so thrown off by that point that we're not expecting it when she closes the medicine cabinet one time, and the scare is there. So that just, like, felt like it was a whole chain of events that was all thought out from that first scene with the baby monitor, and I love the way they use that. And the way they even continue on with that scene, how it goes from the jump scare of the mirror to just a creepiness factor, where she's running the bath, and Jennifer Morrison's just sitting there, like normal. It is worth noting when you think about, you know, Jennifer Morrison, or the scene with the cop in the cemetery kind of reminds me of this too, just a little bit. The fact that this movie did not get much attention when it came out, because it was just coincidentally, unfortunately, like right after The Sixth Sense. And you can definitely see, like, in the style and the way the kid sees what they don't, there are some similarities here, and I think the idea was that audiences basically thought they'd pretty much gotten a better version of this with The Sixth Sense and just didn't really flock to this because of that. Which is unfortunate, because they do definitely have different things going on. A lot of the same things too, but really go in sort of different directions, and do eventually feel like their own 2 different movies. So, and this one has source material, so technically, you know, and Shyamalan may or may not have borrowed from that Are You Afraid of the Dark episode of The Sixth Sense, but that's a whole other thing. So, on that, also, talking about that cop in the cemetery, for instance, we do have scenes like this, where it is, like, we're not quite sure what we're looking at, because at first, it also doesn't help that you kind of have The Sixth Sense in your mind, because it had just come out before this, so you kind of figure, you think you might know what's going on when we see the cop in the cemetery, because it does have a similar vibe, like the way the kid knows his name, and it's like, it feels like there's only one way he would know that, and the fact that the cemetery setting just gives you that whole vibe, and then it's not quite that, where your mind might have been going. Unless I'm the only person that thought Neil was a ghost for a while, despite the fact that Kevin Bacon's wife could see him, even so. It just kind of gives you that vibe. But then it goes into this whole thing of him being in, like, this whole underground place with all these other people that have this same power, and it's like, you're kind of surprised we didn't go in more directions with that, and we didn't, like, kind of explore that more. But at the same time, I think that's better, because it's something that you kind of leaves in your mind, like, you know, I would kind of like to see that, but then it's like, if we explore that anymore, we'd get way off the story that we're on. So it's like, knowing that they just exist is probably interesting enough, because without distracting us from the direction we're already going. Otherwise, it probably would have felt maybe a bit too bloated, or like it was trying to do a little too much, when the confined story that it's got is just fine the way it is, and I like the fact that he recognized that in the writing process and stuck to it. I don't know if the source material goes into that more. I would think surely. But I like the fact that the movie just sort of stays on its path, even if it sort of introduces those things a little bit. Like it said, it may draw you in a little more and make you want to see more, but like I said, in the long run, I think if you imagine putting something like that into the movie and going in a different direction, the story wouldn't have the effect that it already does, and it probably would have been, so it would have been less for it, I think. And then, of course, there's all this kinds of unsettling stuff where they do the different techniques with the camera and all that other stuff, the way they set up their scares. Then there's stuff that just blindsides you. Stuff that they know is going to be effective if they just hit you right in the face with it, physically. Like the fingernail thing is like the only thing I associated with this movie for a very long time. I'm still not over it, like from the first time. So, and like when I know it's coming, I just don't even look at it. I cannot, really. But then it's like you watch it back, and it's like the fingernail gets you so badly. I also forget sometimes about some fucked up shit like the tooth. That really sucks too. But it does get its desired effect, and I do like that the movie's not all that. Like, if the movie was all that, then it would just sort of descend into this unpleasant territory that's sort of irredeemable and relies too much on that kind of, just reaction you get from the audience. So that they only did it, like, a couple of times with the nail and the tooth and all that. And that little premonition he has of Kevin Dunn's son is pretty wicked, too, but... those are the ones that really stand out, but I do like that they didn't say, like, hey, we can just do this all the time because it's going to be effective no matter what. So that works. But then, once again, we do get to our ending where everything is pretty much revealed, and it is a typical, like, a typical ghost story ending where it's like, hey, find my body, find my killers, and then everything will be okay. But the thing here, though, that's interesting is when we see what happened to the Jennifer Morrison character in the whole flashback, where we get the whole thing, it's very interesting and makes the movie stand out in a really good way in regards to how it sort of diverts off the horror thing and makes her death like really tragic and heartbreaking, and that's where the whole sort of horror of it stems from. It's also probably a bit of a cliche too, but I think that the movie handles it really well and handles that character enough to where, even though we only see her for a brief period, she's there just enough that, because I don't think Jennifer Morrison is like that strong of an actress at all, but it's weird that this is like one of her very first movies and she makes this much impact in just a little bit and brings like the whole emotional core of the movie to life. Or death, whatever. I do really like how, I was talking about that earlier, but just in general, on top of the horror and how well it's put together, the whole heart of it too really brings it to a nice close as well, so I thought that they handled that really nicely, so, and just the look of it in general, where it's like grounded in this sort of reality, makes the scares all the more, like, unexpected and terrifying when they actually happen, so... so all this is just really well done and really well put together. More or less from beginning to end. I'm trying to remember every now and then maybe there's something that's a bit too, into it, but overall, I do think, yeah, as like a ghost movie, it pretty much does just about everything it needs to, and it's, like I said, unfortunately it may not be at as high of a status as it could have been because it had so much competition at the time, but I think it still stands quite nicely amongst the kind of traditional ghost movie and all that. So, and sort of, that mystery they tend to throw into horror also. It does really nicely. So that's how I feel about that. And then going on to the Mothman Prophecies, obviously I thought about this movie quite differently than I probably would have if, number one, it didn't take place where it does, and number two, I wasn't as young as I was when I saw it. Because it was January 2002, so I would have just turned 11. So, and pretty much everybody was talking up, hey, it's really happened, and all that, and it's like, oh, it's only an hour away from here, and stuff like that, and it's like, when you're 11, you're pretty much, you don't totally buy it, but there's a portion of you that's, like, still a little susceptible to that. So, but when you look at it now, because there's always kind of been that connotation to it, that I saw it, like, that young and knowing that about it. that I didn't realize until I watched it many, many years later that this is a movie that came out in January of 2002. And it's like, oh shit, this movie, I never thought about it back then. I never could have. But now that I know what I know, the Mothman Prophecies is just another fucking January horror movie. The shit that comes out every year that nobody really cares about, that just comes and goes and then just disappears and is usually just dumped in January. I do think it's a little above that. But needless to say, it is not exactly however you want to describe it, the sort of high above movie that I initially thought it was at 11 years old. So, that was a bit more terrifying and jarring at the time. So, with that in mind, it does have, the director is somebody who was established at the time, Mark Pellington is his name, who made Arlington Road, that is sort of a movie that's slipped under the tongue for a while, but seems to be getting a nice reputation as time goes on, the one with Jeff Bridges and Tim Robbins. And here, it actually has a very interesting start. Because once again, it doesn't really, as far as I can remember, start with much of a scare. The way it begins, we get this opening title sequence, and it almost seems like it's like the opening title sequence to a movie about journalism, because we see Gear at his job, and then it's just him going home to Deborah Messing, and them going to look for a house and shit, as she's, like, getting ready for this, and it's like, it really doesn't feel like a horror movie when it gets started, but there is something sort of moody about it, that's kind of interesting and kind of pulls you in. Like, if there's one thing about this movie you can't fault, it's atmospheric as fuck, regardless of what the story is, or how they handle that kind of stuff, but, because when you look at it, the way I was talking about, like the way the camera moves in Stir of Echoes, and you can say a similar thing about the Mothman Prophecies, but it's much more distant about it. Because when you get this whole sort of Mothman-like vibe, where, you know, he is supposedly, like, moth-like, obviously, like, there's so many camera shots, especially in the more sinister scenes, when it feels like we're seeing the point of view of something that's, like, flying over all of them, or the way that, it sort of reminds me of the opening shot of The Shining, when they're driving while the credits are rolling, where it feels like we're seeing something from a bit more of a sort of demonic force from a safe distance. And, like, that particular shot, when they've just gotten one of, like, the backstories of one of the witnesses, and that shot just, like, backs away in this really big way to where it starts with them, and we see, like, sort of the whole town as it backs away, and it definitely feels like we're seeing a point of view shot. This isn't just the camera moving. So it has this feeling, like, almost non-stop throughout the movie of the characters being watched in this really sort of sinister way from the camera's perspective, which I think is really cool and really well done. And then, of course, we have the moments, like, just the individual horror moments, like when he's in the hospital after Deborah Messing has died, and it starts off like it's going to be this sort of poignant scene when the orderly comes in and says it's basically like she knew she was going to die, because it came suddenly. He had to get the phone call, and we don't even see it happen. But it's like, there's like a comfort, and it's like she knew it was coming because she was drawing angels. And like once there's a comfort in that, Gear picks up the book, and we realize that's not what the hell it is at all. And like with each page that he turns, the more terrifying it kind of gets. And I really like that sort of, like, it leads us in, like it's going to be something nice, and then we see that shit. Is kind of a really nice payoff to that. But then, of course, you know, it does go into the January horror movie cliches. There's jump scares here and there, some of which don't even seem to make sense. Like the head in the mirror thing is still not quite, I don't know if that's like somehow related to the way Deborah Messing's head hit the car window when they crashed. I don't really know. It's probably just there for a jump scare, honestly. And then you bring in like the respectable actor to be an exposition machine. In this case, they scored Alan Bates, and playing a character named Bleak, which of course backwards is oh god, what was his name? Keel. Is the, obviously, of course, because what I'm about to tell you is the fact that they named the character Leak because it's Keel backwards. Great. And I have Keel's book around here somewhere, of this, but the dude that was like all about the UFOs and supposedly saw these events in like what was it, November of '66 to December of '67. It says the whole story on the back of this shirt, which of course I can't read at the moment, but it's I think that's what the dates are. And so, which basically goes into the whole true events thing here. It's like, yeah, it's another one of those cases where it's like, yeah, it's about as based on true events as pretty much all the other movies that have said this, which means not particularly. I mean, they do use the whole Silver Bridge thing, but overall, which you kind of start to wonder how much in poor taste is that really. But I mean, there are still things in here like. One of the great scenes of the movie, the scenes that like have stuck with me for years, would be the scene in the motel that was in all the TV spots and the trailers back then when it's basically Indrid Cold proving that he has this ability to know what's going on. So he does the whole, anytime Gear does something, he can tell him what it is over the phone and stuff like that. That scene's always been really cool and has never lost its effect. Especially with the way it's shot also, where Gear, like, every time it happens, Gear turns off another light until he's pretty much submerged in darkness with just this sort of muffled lamplight in front of him, and it's like, but the way it's shot where there's one particular shot where he's talking, and the Gear's just sort of down here in the shot, and everything else is the blackness of the room, and it's almost like you just expect to see something lurking there. You certainly feel like some sort of presence. It's a really damn good scene. And then, as I was talking about, there's the introduction of the Will Patton character, which kind of brings a certain, like an unpredictable quality to it a little bit. When the first time he sees him, he pulls him in and pulls the shotgun on him. And at first we just think maybe Will Patton's crazy. We end up thinking that often throughout the movie, but it's also this whole idea that supposedly Richard Gere's character has been to his door 3 different times and has just, I guess, been stalking him, supposedly. And the fact that Gere has somehow gotten into Point Pleasant mysteriously, because he was supposed to be going, like, hundreds of miles the other way, and then he ended up somehow here, like, inexplicably. And so, once we get all these details, it is sort of like the Mothman thing kind of sort of comes and goes out of your mind a little bit, and you start to think more of stuff like, well, maybe is the Mothman somehow, like, depends on what exactly they're doing with that whole setup. To where there's a mystery around it and a vagueness around it intentionally, to where it's like, is he somehow responsible for, or it, whatever, is it somehow responsible for this? Is there something wrong with Gere's mind that he doesn't remember this stuff? Is Will Patton the crazy one? I don't know. Will Patton's character in general is just sort of, has this unsettling quality to him. Like, I saw this before I saw Remember the Titans. So it was like, for a long time when I would see Will Patton in movies, he just sort of creeped me out in general, because this was the first thing I saw him in. But I eventually got over that as I saw him in more things, but even so, the effect is still there to an extent. And so the way they play with that vagueness can probably be a bit frustrating, because it can make the movie seem like really directionless. I can easily see people finding this movie boring, where it feels like there's just stretches of people like analyzing stuff, but it doesn't really go much anywhere because nothing is ever explained. But there is something kind of cool about that too. The way they, I mean, yeah, I understand that it can definitely seem like lazy, but if it's done just right, which not to say the movie does everything right by any means, but because there are those stretches there, it feels too long. It could be chopped down. And you can have a lot more of those more effective scenes, like the motel scene. Like, if this movie were a lot more of that kind of stuff, this could have been, like, incredible and, like, potentially, like, legendary, but we don't quite get that. But there is stuff here that really makes that come through. The Tom and Andy score is really good and really effective. But the thing here also is our eventual finale, which is probably one of the most memorable scenes in the movie, apart from the motel scene, where they recreate this bridge collapse, which to my understanding is, like, entirely a practical effect, and they had to do, like, I think it was, like, 3 weeks or something, and it was, like, the dude with a bunch of production assistants, and they did, like, a whole bunch of miniatures. There was, like 20,000 pieces to this thing or something to get it just right. Just this really, really elaborate thing, shot over, like, this giant water tank in one of the studios. And it is a huge sort of big set piece. It does have some flaws. Like, as far as the destruction itself and its appearance, it looks flawless, quite honestly. Not to say that the scene is flawless, though. I mean, you do have stuff like the stock scream effects you can hear plain as day. There's one particularly odd choice where maybe it's their way of showing like the personal tragedy of it and the particular victims, where we meet that couple once that tell about their experience, and then we see them again on the bridge, and it's the dude just in his car, and we see this dude basically get his head taken off by one of the wires when it snaps. And for some reason, shortly after this, we cut to the girl who we've learned they're engaged earlier. She comes out to see the collapse, like, in her wedding dress. And it's like we see her, like, buying her wedding dress and getting fitted for it, just as we've seen the dude she was supposedly going to marry get his face taken off by a wire. And it's like, number one, we don't really know those people enough for that to be anything short of, well, that was a cheap way to make us feel bad for them. And secondly, also, like I said, it's like I kind of maybe see what they're doing, to, like, maybe show it as a bit of a tragedy on top of just the sort of big action scene that it is in general. But yeah, that also, even though they, like, vaguely link it to the Mothman, it does seem like it's the climax to a totally different movie, and then it just kind of stops, and it's like, oh, after this, we never heard from him again. You know, he was supposedly seen all around the world. It's weird. But, yeah, so it does feel like it kind of abruptly ends with not much of a payoff for what we saw. So, like I said, it really just kind of depends on you in regards to, like, if you see that as effective or not, that we don't know that much overall and nothing is really explained, and it just kind of stays weird and mysterious. Yeah, it can seem cheap and lazy, and I get it, but I think it works overall. But then again, you know, I had the whole backstory. So if this came out today and I saw it, I would probably be trashing the shit out of it, quite honestly. So, so that's pretty much where I stand with that. And while we're on the subject of being only an hour away from Point Pleasant, I'm going to turn the lights back on for a second and show you something. So as you may or may not be aware, obviously Point Pleasant also has this Mothman Festival that they do pretty much every year. This was the one from like last year, I think. Yes. And they pretty much have just about anything you could think of. They've got all that shit, like everything from live bands to guest speakers who like specialize in the paranormal and all that. He's got a statue, the bus tours, the costumes, the museum, all that other shit. The vendors selling stuff like this. They really go all out with the Mothman related like food items with you see they really go in for like the red eyes and stuff like that. It's like their main selling point or something. Dudes that do stuff like this, all that kinds of stuff. There's another poster that goes more into the whole UFO thing and the so-called Men in Black, which I think would have been an interesting concept that the movie could have gone into, but I'm gonna guess that since the name Men in Black was sort of taken by another certain property, is why they didn't go in that direction. So, and of course, they sell a shitload of these. So, with all that said, I still think I prefer Stir of Echoes, as far as just being so consistently well done through the whole thing, and so well thought out. Like I said, I know some people may go against it, but I do like the way, the Mothman Prophecies sort of has fun with the vague and the not really explained, even if they probably could have done a bit more with it and been a little less generic in the long run. So I think that's where I'm going to leave this. So you're going to have another one coming up pretty much right after this, where we go into Disney territory. So yeah, so I'm probably going to shoot that right now. So until then,